Good evening, everyone, and welcome to one of the highlight events of International Space University's SSP16 program here at the Technion in Haifa, Israel. I'm John Conley, the program director, and I'd like to welcome you to our annual Arthur C. Clarke panel. The theme of the panel this year is Where Space Meets Popular Culture. And this has become a very popular panel over the years because we see how space influences the work of people in the humanities. So it's not an engineering panel tonight. It's going to be far more interesting than that. We have a great panel, and Chris will introduce them in a minute. You'll have a chance to ask questions after we're done. Some quick thank yous before we begin. Tremendous thanks again for the Technion for hosting us, and to all of our sponsors who make it possible for us to be here. Special thanks to the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation, who has made this evening possible as well. And finally, I'd like to thank our panelists tonight from traveling from places around the world to be with us, to join us. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Professor Chris Welch. Chris is my colleague from International Space University. He is the director of the master's program at ISU. He started his professional career working as a space scientist at the University of Kent on the Giotto and Ulysses missions. He is very active in the IAF. He has participated in more than 20 IACs, and is twice the former chair of the Federation's Space and Education Outreach Committee. In 2015, he was the recipient of the IAF Distinguished Service Award. Outside the IAF, Chris is a vice president, council member, and fellow of the British Interplanetary Society, a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, and a member of many other prestigious societies. In 2009, he was awarded the Sir Arthur Clarke Award for Space Education. Please help me now welcome our moderator for this evening, Professor Chris Welch, and our Arthur C. Clarke panelists.
Good. Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to the Sir Arthur Clarke panel. This is the second ISU Sir Arthur Clarke panel. First one was last year in 2015 at Ohio. Volume suddenly increasing a little bit. It celebrates the intersection of space and popular culture in the same way that Arthur Clarke's works popularized space, whether they were his fictional works or his non-fictional works. So everything that, I guess, engages the public, books, films, social media, music, art, all of those cultural endeavors are relative to this panel. We're very lucky to have an excellent range of panelists. The way the evening is going to run is I'm going to invite each one in turn and introduce them to give a short presentation of their work. After that, I'm going to pose them some questions, which we were discussing earlier. We had quite an exciting discussion over in the Wunderbar, for those of you who know the Wunderbar. Probably will continue there later on, but that's another question. And then we will accept questions from the audience, both here in the room and outside. So if you're watching on the live stream and you want to ask a question, if you tweet it with the hashtag #SSP16, by the miracle of technology and then paper, that question will make its way to me, and if I can, I will ask it. So without any more ado, I would like to introduce Chris Riley. If you go over to the podium, Chris, and I'll read your bio as you're getting set up. Chris originally gained a PhD in planetary geomorphology from Imperial College in London in 1995, but after that his career took a different direction and he joined the BBC in the Radio Science Unit, which was the first step in a long career in media as a film producer, director and writer, specializing in science, engineering and history. His work has been celebrated by BAFTA, the US Television Academy, the Royal Television Society, the Sundance Institute and the Grierson Trust. He conceived and co-produced the multi-award-winning feature documentary In the Shadow of the Moon, produced and directed the hit documentary recreation of Gagarin's pioneering flight First Orbit, which I'm pleased to say ISU had an engagement with as well and involved in. And for those of you who know what such things are, he also wrote the best-selling Haynes Ownership Workshop Manual on Apollo. For those of you who don't know Haynes, it's a UK car maintenance manual, but so Chris wrote one on the Lunar Excursion module, amongst others. He's a regular contributor to newspapers and presents science documentaries for BBC Radio 4. Without any more, Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, good, thank you. Well, so I've been asked to talk a little bit about how space has inspired my work, and I wanted, I suppose, to start by saying that I don't make films about space. I'm not really that interested in space, purely. I don't know why I'm here, actually. No. What I do is I make films about people. And so it just happens that many of the people that I've made films about have been engaged in activities that overlap with this genre that brings us all here. So I was a child of Apollo. This is me in 1969 talking to Neil and Buzz on the surface of the moon there. In fact, at the time we lived in a house called the White House, just coincidentally, just as Nixon did, and that was still on the right is taken from Nixon's phone call to the two of them. But my point is that as I was growing up, people were living on the moon. They were going there, as I got a bit older, for 3 days at a time, exploring over 100 kilometers, carrying lunar rovers and driving around there, literally living on another world. A few years later, we were landing on the surface of Mars, and I had this picture up in my bedroom and was really taken by it. And I would write about these missions in my diary. This was a page from my diary from 1979, a few years later when the Voyager spacecraft, I couldn't really spell Voyager, I hope you don't mind that. My spelling was really terrible, but I was really interested in these sorts of stories from beyond Earth as these probes carried out our spirit of exploration to the stars. And a few years after that, of course, the space shuttle came online, and on a very rare, unique, in fact, visit to a town in the UK, it arrived a few years later on the back of its carrier plane, and I cycled all the way down the road to go and have a look at it. So these sort of stories were a real kind of backdrop to my life, I guess, and that's what I grew up with. And a few years later, when I started to think about a career and eventually chose storytelling, which is essentially what filmmakers do, it was these stories that I sort of turned to for inspiration. And a film that Chris mentioned earlier, Ron Howard's movie In the Shadow of the Moon, which I produced a few years ago, is a good example of that. Many of the films that I've made have been using found footage. And thankfully for all of us, NASA filmed something like 10,000 rolls of 16mm film between 1958 and 1972, covering their Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. And they were all held in store, a lot of them at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and a few at other centers around the US. And I started going through these. In fact, I went through all 10,000 rolls of that film's collection on paper and then pulled out the best 1,000 rolls. And it was a bit like being back there myself, as you kind of wind these films through the viewer and you kind of look at them, these images of these amazing decades when we dreamed such big dreams and then made them happen in the 1960s. Were there for me flickering across the screen. And what I found really beautiful about these rolls of film is that they were all shot for engineering purposes, not really for documentary makers or artists to use. Many of them, including 13 hours of really precious footage that was shot beyond the Earth by humans on these data acquisition cameras. Largely, as I say, for engineering purposes, for particular things that the spacecraft were doing, but also it was a chance to capture something of life for the crews on board the command modules as well. And when you started to mix this footage up with the interviews that we were collecting with these extraordinary human beings who'd gone beyond the Earth back then, there was something really beautiful about seeing how time had had an effect on them over those 4 decades since they'd made these incredible journeys. And I found them in their mid-70s, I suppose, when we made this film about 10 years ago, to be very reflective. Enough time had passed by then that they'd had a good portion of their lives to think about what that adventure that they'd all been part of really meant. That film is not really about Apollo or the moon. In the Shadow of the Moon is actually about America. And it's about humankind and the human spirit of exploration, really, of course. I want to play you a little clip from the film now, which is about the men reflecting on this view of the Earth that they had as they left it behind. And you'll hear from Gene Cernan, Edgar Mitchell, and Mike Collins.
In Earth orbit, the horizon is just slightly curved. When you head on out to the moon in very short order, and you get a chance to look back at the Earth, that horizon slowly curves around and upon itself, and all of a sudden you're looking at something that's very strange, but it is very, very familiar, because you're beginning to see the Earth evolve.
I was able to look out the window to see this incredible sight of the whole circle of the Earth. Oceans were crystal blue, the land was brown, and the clouds and the snow were pure white, and that jewel of Earth was just hung up in the blackness of space. The only people that have seen the whole circle of the Earth are the 24 guys that went to the moon.
When you see Earth like that, it's powerful. Not any bigger than that, way up there.
How peaceful and calm and quiet and serene it looked. How fragile it appeared. That was oddly enough, the overriding sensation I got looking at the Earth was, my God, that little thing is so fragile out there.
You get to see the Earth receding, you get to see the moon coming towards you, and it's awe-inspiring. And to start to identify, hey, we're going to be up there pretty soon, and bye-bye back there.
And the more I reflected myself on what these stories said about society, the more I found inspiration in these endeavors that come naturally from doing these big, difficult engineering projects. And we do them as a species. And the new perspective that that gives us is something I think is well worth celebrating in popular culture. I wanted to read another little diary extract here, not from my diary this time, but from my father's diary. This is an entry that he wrote on the 12th of April, 1961. A warm, damp, muggy day, and a momentous one in the history of the world. The first man was shot into orbit around the Earth by the Russians, and as I listened to a recording of him talking back to Earth on the wireless in the evening, I felt I was listening to the most profound event in the millions of years of the Earth's history, and I felt somewhat privileged. Well, of course, he was writing about the flight of Yuri Gagarin, and as the 50th anniversary of Gagarin approached, I started to look at ways I could sort of celebrate this momentous moment in human history as well. And the footage that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there is pretty much all that exists of Gagarin's flight on Vostok 1 that day, because we were more interested during those early forays into orbit by the reactions of those that went, the people, how it affected them to ride on rockets, than we were about what they actually saw. So there's no footage of what Gagarin actually saw from his spacecraft. So I looked up his orbit to see what I could do about maybe piecing it together again from that anniversary, perhaps going back to NASA's archive film that spanned several decades by then, of course, with shuttle-era footage, but trying to match shots to the same time of day and the same geographical location as Gagarin had flown over proved just too difficult. And then in early 2010, the cupola was installed onto the International Space Station. Here you can see it with Tracy Caldwell Dyson. And I suddenly thought, you know what, now we've got such a great window on the Earth, perhaps I could film it again. So this was the first film I'd ever made that started with a maths problem, where I went to the European Space Agency and said, look, how often do you think the space station goes over the same bit of the Earth at the same time of day as Vostok 1 did? And we worked out that it was about every 6 weeks there was a portion of Vostok 1's orbit that we could film. So I recruited a director of photography who was heading up that way a few months later, Paolo Nespoli. And here he is in action on the right there, filming out of the cupola during his stay at that time on the station towards the end of 2010. So he started sending footage back as and when we could capture it, and I wove it together with a new soundtrack from composer Philip Shepard, who'd also worked on In the Shadow of the Moon. And I managed to spring the original voice recordings that Gagarin had made from Vostok 1 from the Russian archives, which was actually harder than filming from the space station. Anyway, I combined all that together and then teamed up with Google to premiere it to the world on the 12th of April to the 2nd, 50 years after Gagarin's flight. And it was a big hit. Surprisingly, it became the most watched long-form film release in YouTube history. 2 million viewers in 48 hours. And simultaneously, we crowdsourced a premiere of the film around the world for the 50th anniversary, and it aired on 1,600 screens in 140 countries, making it one of the most widely premiered films in history. These anniversaries, I guess, are a chance to reflect and celebrate the kinds of milestones that I'm talking about in popular culture. And I think for me they're a reminder as well of how special we are as a species, something that's easy to forget in the day-to-day melee of life, I think. And perhaps it's even an antidote to the sorts of divisive political rhetoric which permeate society today. As Sir Fred Hoyle said in 1948, once a photograph of the Earth is taken from outside, it's inevitable a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. And that's often forgotten today, but to end there, as I've done with the Voyager 1 picture from Valentine's Day 1990 from 4 billion miles away of Earth, it's a folly to think of ourselves as from Israel or from the United Kingdom or from France or Germany or America. We have to consider ourselves from Earth, and that's a big driver in the inspiration that space has for the films that I make. Thank you very much.
Button. I'd now like to introduce, from my right, Eric Choi. The most important thing to know about Eric is that he is an ISU alum, and as a result he incorporates the interdisciplinary aspects that we expect to see in all people who participate in ISU. He is an aerospace engineer, yes, but he is also a science fiction writer and an editor. He has a bachelor's degree in engineering science and a master's in aerospace engineering, both from the University of Toronto, also an MBA from York University. He's worked on a number of space projects, including the Phoenix Mars lander, the space station Canadarm2 on the International Space Station, RadarSat-1, the Terra satellites, and the intriguingly entitled Quantum Encryption and Science satellite. He's also created and co-edited 2 science fiction collections, Carbide Tip Pens and The Dragon and the Stars, and his work has appeared in many books as well as magazines, Analog Science Fiction and Fact, periodical I have a special fondness for, since it was the first science fiction magazine I started reading when I was a teenager, Asimov's Science Fiction and Science Fiction Age, and he has twice won Canada's Prix Aurora Award for his work. Eric.
Thank you very much, Chris. So, to put on my Simpsons persona, hi, I'm Eric Choi. You may remember me from ISU core lectures like space robotics and spacecraft subsystems too. So I'm here to assure you, as John has, that this is not an engineering lecture. Far from it, in fact. And as Chris was explaining, my presence here initially caused some confusion. Like, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing up there? And I guess I've taken to heart something that I once heard Peter Diamandis, the co-founder of ISU, say, that given a choice between A and B, well, why not take both? And why not indeed? As Chris has reminded us, interdisciplinary is the first I in ISU. So if you're a lawyer, go out there and build that robot. And I saw that happen last week. If you're a physicist, go out there, paint that painting. If you're an engineer, go out there, compose and sing that song. And do those things. Do those things without fear, and do it with joy. So as for myself, I've been writing since secondary school. I've had 14 short stories published so far, 2 more coming out later this year, one of which was actually inspired by an ISU team project from a number of years ago. I've co-edited 2 short story collections, as Chris has explained, Carbide Tip Pens and The Dragon and the Stars. And unfortunately, for a number of logistical reasons, unlike John Logston, I was actually not able to bring a good number of my books with me. However, I did manage to bring exactly 1 copy of this book, Far Orbit, which I will be giving away at the end of my remarks as a prize for answering a trivia question. So we're going to have a little bit of fun with this. This notion of technical people, of engineers and scientists writing science fiction is actually really not that unusual. The gentleman for whom this panel is named, Sir Arthur C. Clarke himself, of course, had a technical background, but many others as well. Some of the pictures there, Julie Cherneda, my good friend from Canada, is a biologist. That's David Brin on the bottom right, Catherine Asaro, and Liu Kaixin from China is an engineer. And if you've not read The Three-Body Problem, which was recently translated into English, I highly, highly recommend it. Just a fantastic piece of work, not just from a scientific stand, but from an international and a cultural standpoint, because there are aspects, cultural aspects to the story blended with the science fiction that truly do make it unique. And I'm not getting royalties from him, it's because I genuinely really like the book. What space has also done, this is something that we hear over and over again, science fiction rather, is this is something that has inspired people to pursue careers in mathematics or physics or engineering. And there's plenty of examples, of which just a few are pictured here. People like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Donna Shirley, who was the project manager for the Mars Pathfinder mission, the great Carl Sagan himself, all said that they were inspired to get into this field of space through the works of science fiction that they had read as a child. Now, this was a part of a dinner conversation we had on Tuesday, was the impact of science fiction not only inspiring careers, but potentially inspiring the development of new technologies as well. So I understand that there's Qualcomm tricoder X Prize, for those of you who are Star Trek fans like I am, trying to develop a real tricorder as it was portrayed in the Star Trek television series and movies. And of course, probably one of the examples that people are most familiar with is tablet computers, something that appeared in various guises in Star Trek and of course is now a reality. Now, this actually isn't the quiz question, but this picture of good Captain Picard is, I think, a little bit unusual in some ways. Does anybody have any thoughts on this? Anybody picked up what is a little odd about that picture? Well, how many tablets does a guy actually need? He's got a whole pile there. And I found this picture to illustrate a point that we often say that science fiction is predictive, that it looks to the future, and that's very true. I would argue that science fiction is generally good at predicting the generalities, but off sometimes on the details, perhaps. So they got the tablet right, but not the idea of universality or multifunction, that you don't have a separate communicator and a tricoder and a computer, that all three of those things could in fact be one device. And what they're doing here is essentially electronic paper, a pile of electronic clipboards, essentially. And we see examples of this over and over again, of predicting the thing in generalities, but missing out on some of the details. Now, I'm sure you all remember this from about 6 years ago, when the Chinese vessel Xian landed on Europa, and the crew was tragically killed by a big green thingamajigger that came out of the ice, right? This was all over the news, and well, of course it wasn't, or at least not in this particular timeline. And so Arthur Clarke, again, postulated the exploration of the gas giants, the exploration of the outer solar system. And while the Xian and the Discovery did not in fact go to the Jovian system in 2001 and 2010, in our reality, in fact, we have explored the outer solar system and the gas giants. We've explored all the major classes of bodies in the solar system. It's just that we haven't done it with people. We've done it with, wait for it, robots, right? Robots. Does that make for good drama? I don't know. Maybe this is something that the panel and the audience can talk about later in this session. Now, one science fiction prediction that I find quite fascinating, we talk a lot about new space and commercial space. Well, in science fiction, if one were to go back to the 30s and 40s and 50s, space exploration was all private. It was something like Heinlein's rocket ship Galileo, where a teenage boy, and this was the 1940s, so unfortunately they were all boys, would have some weird uncle who's building a spaceship in his garage, and then they launch this spaceship off to the moon, and they find Nazis there, and they beat them up. The notion that there would be a Canadian Space Agency or a NASA or an ESA or some kind of government entity, some kind of government bureaucracy doing space was actually something that was never really predicted in science fiction. It was all private, and I think it's actually kind of neat that the trajectory of the real life space efforts are sort of tracking back to what science fiction had predicted, that it's going to be largely commercially and privately driven. It's one of my favorite pictures. So this is the guy in the middle in the brown, lovely 1970s fashion is, of course, the great Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, and with some of the cast of the original television show from the 1960s, on the occasion of the rollout of the first space shuttle, which was, of course, named the Enterprise, after the famous fictional starship. Roddenberry loved space. He loved space exploration, and he often said that one of his greatest hopes for Star Trek was that it would inspire people and make people realize the importance of our present-day exploration of outer space, which actually leads me to another interesting question that I kind of posed to the panel and you to the audience as well. So on Tuesday, I had the great opportunity to join the SADAPS and the science departments of ISU on a tour of the Israel Oceanographic and Limographic Research Institute here in Haifa. And during the presentation, there were some interesting facts and figures that were relayed to us, and I apologize if I don't get this exactly right, but it was something like about 5% of the bottom of the ocean has actually been mapped, and it's estimated about half of the species that are in... Can you hear me okay? Okay, here we go. That are in the ocean are actually unknown to us, and that we've spent as civilization, I guess, if you will, about 150 times more money and resources on space exploration than exploring the bottom of the ocean. Now, if you are a biologist or an ecologist or a geologist, you would probably pretty legitimately argue that the bottom of the ocean is actually a much more interesting place than the surface of the moon or the surface of Mars that we actually know a lot more about. So the question I'm going to throw to the panel and for all of you to think about is, how much of an influence do you think science fiction had on this? Because there's tons of great science fiction from Gene Roddenberry and Robert Heinlein and Liu Kai-shing and others about how awesome it is to go into space. And I'm cool with that. That's great, because I'm a space guy. But there's relatively little stuff about going to the bottom of the ocean. So I'd be curious to see what people's thoughts are on these ties between popular culture and space and how they might actually influence how resources are actually expended. Okay, so I'm about done here. It's quiz time for your chance to win a copy of Far Orbit. So is everybody ready? All right, all right. So I'm going to enlist the help of my fellow panelists here to help me spot which hand comes up first. So the question is, the SpaceX Falcon rockets are named after what science fiction starship? So who was first? Did you see? Is that it? Okay.
Millennium Falcon.
Okay, the Millennium Falcon is correct. In fact, I would have accepted Aluminum Falcon or Hunk of Junk. But what's your name, please? Eric. Well, what a coincidence. This is not fixed, by the way. I swear this is not fixed. Eric, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Please come up and meet me after the panel, and I'll give you your book. So that's it for me as I jump through the Stargate, or actually in this case, jump possibly to my death in the parking lot below, and I'll turn it over back to Chris.
Okay, thank you, Eric. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tim Otto Roth. He studied philosophy and politics at the University of Tübingen and then arts at the Kunsthochschule Kassel. After graduating in the theory of visual communication, he gained a PhD from the Academy of Media Studies in Cologne. He's known for his large art and science projects in public spaces involving scientists from institutions such as Max Planck Gesellschaft, European Southern Observatories, the Hubble Space Telescope Institute, and similar. His major fields of interest are in astrophysics and molecular and neurobiology. He's received numerous awards, such as the German Light Art Award, the International Media Art Award, and his work has been shown in many museums and galleries around the world. And he's a member of the European Space Agency topical team in the arts and the sciences. Tim, over to you.
Well, I will tell you a bit about space travel, but space travel in a different way, because I consider every human being as a space traveler, because we live all on a spaceship, and that's spaceship Earth, traveling through space and time, and being exposed to numerous stuff, radiation, matter. And the great thing is, if we measure this exposure to all this stuff, for instance, photons, or here see a picture of exposure of our Earth here to solar wind, and well, measuring this exposure to all this stuff tells you something about space, the space we are traveling through. For instance, by such an array, this used to be a cosmic ray detector array measuring cosmic air showers. It was based in Karlsruhe at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And they're measuring cosmic rays. So these are small atomic particles traveling with tremendous energies through space and hitting by accident the Earth atmosphere and trickling down secondary particles. And right sitting here now at the moment, everybody of you, well, there are particles, secondary particles going through our bodies. We don't see it. And my aim was really to show this exposure, and I created and designed mirror sculptures, light sculptures. They got in a strobe, 16 of these pieces, and I put these pieces into that research field. And every time when an air shower was hitting this part of the field, the mirror sculpture was flashing up. So, and the interesting thing is it was very well received, and even, well, it was for the shutting down of this experiment. We got a review in Nature. It's quite a seldom case getting for shutting down experiment getting in Nature paper. And I'm just preparing the new project, which will take place in mid-September in Stuttgart. Putting detectors, 16 detectors on the roof, making measurements, and you see, well, you have red lit stairwells, and if we have exposure over this part, it will flash up. And we do a new thing, we do also reconstructions of the angle where this air shower of particles came from, and we will point to here with a sky beamer. Well, you get on idea what kind of concept of space travel I'm talking now. And I was a bit in trouble when I was 2005 by the London-based office, the Arts Catalyst, to think about a cultural project for the International Space Station. Well, first of all, I was a bit puzzled because International Space Station, for me, first of all, it's a cultural project. Well, it was a cultural mission, while bringing people up to space. Well, for sure, I also had a personal problem, because you know my concept of space travel, but there was something triggering my interest. And you had recently here Buzz Aldrin, and he made a very special phenomenon public as the first man, because when he was up in space, and his eyes were dark adapted, he saw light phenomena. Even with his eyes closed, he saw dots, streaks, and cloudy flashes. And as it turned out later, this is due to the exposure of the astronauts to cosmic radiation. And well, I developed a couple of projects, and one of the project series I'm still working on is trying, well, I can't expose human beings to, heavy radiations, but to find alternative ways to create such light flashes, so-called phosphenes. And one method was, for instance, an experiment in the university clinics in Ulm, in using magnetic fields. It worked pretty good with the visual cortex on the back, but we had problems to go through the bones around the eyeball. But I found a quite effective way how to excite a retina, putting here on the left and right one, 2 electrodes, and switching on DC. And when I switched on DC, I saw a flash on the right eye. It looked like that. It was a blue, foggy flash. And when I switched off the current, I had another flash, a bit fainter, on the other eye. So this is what I'm currently working on with regards, well, to the flashes. Well, I'm doing experience, I'm planning experience with ultrasound and so on. So coming back again more to Earth, and more to every human being as being a space traveler. Imagine when started up this kind of way of imagining space traveling. Do you have an idea when this started up? But it started up with people looking up to the sky. If you look up to the sky, you see a flat affair. Everything there is in the same focal plane. And we start up to imagine a depth, for instance, by observing planetary motion, because you say, okay, there's one object moving on that level, and then because they do not collide, so you're creating, by imagination, a space. And this is the point where it starts up space traveling. And this space traveling get a tremendous push in the last century, and by a tremendous expansion of space, because if you look here, for instance, to Andromeda, this is a historical record 100 years ago. The point is, imagine the concept of a galaxy. It was proven in 1927 by Edwin Hubble. Before, we were not sure what kind of that thing it really is. Is it part of the Milky Way? And so this triggered a massive expansion of the universe. So today we talk about, oh, galaxy, blah, blah, blah. This is a quite recent development. It started up, Hubble triggered it 90 years ago. And since then, the universe is expanding, exploding, we discover new things. And, well, and one of a crucial discovery was by the end, or in the 1990s, is that we discovered that our universe is expanding, well, the younger universe in a accelerated way. It expands faster, faster, and faster. And when he was asked by Hubble Space Telescope to think about a second project, I did a project before with Hubble Space Telescope, it was clear for me it needs somehow be related to this expansion, or this accelerated expansion of the universe. And well, it's a bit related to the idea, you know, also from space engineering. Well, I created a kind of centrifuge. That's the centrifuge at Goddard Space Center, which I visited 3 years ago. And that's my centrifuge. I'm not using light. I'm using loudspeakers, and every loudspeaker plays sine tones. And sine tones with different frequencies. It lights up when a loudspeaker is active, and the color decodes the frequencies. The deep frequencies are red, and the higher they go, they turn over the spectrum up to blue with the high pitches. And and if you put up this into rotation, it bends like that, and it has an exponential function of acceleration. So imagine what happens if you stand under this carousel under moving sine waves. What happens there? Where are the physicists? Well, there's not noise. There's an incredible sound. But what happens? You not always hear the same frequency, but it's simply because due to it's the Doppler effect, exactly. So, and if the source approaches you, the pitches are higher, and if it goes away, so the pitches go down. So, and it depends also on the velocity, it depends on the level, and it depends where you stand under the carousel. There's one special point under the carousel where there's no Doppler effect. Where is it? It's exactly in the center. So, in a way, what you're doing under the heavens carousel is you're doing a kind of time travel through a sound universe. You start in the middle, no expansion, and the Doppler effect comes more and more into the effect the more you step outwards. So just a few impressions. The premiere was at the Hubble Space Telescope Conference in Rome in 2014 at the Accademia delle Lincei in Rome. Here a short impression, and we showed it in occasion of Hubble's 25th anniversary in Baltimore last year. And this is the most recent presentation in Karlsruhe, and I will show you by the end just a movie impression so that you really get an impression how it really sounds like. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Our last panelist is Anna Brzezinska. She is an independent filmmaker and audiovisual producer based in Warsaw, Poland, and coincidentally, no connection, Strasbourg in France. She's a fourth-generation artist. She came from a theatrical family and was educated for the stage, but obviously has a kind of clear perception of the future because since she was 18, she's been writing, directing, editing, producing documentary films, television series, digital stories, and similar. And in particular, since 2015, she's been working on a large transmedia co-production called The Future of Forever, which I will let her say something about. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, I know we were supposed to wait a little while. Thank you, Chris. First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a huge honor to be present amongst you, especially that, well, I'm not a space guy, also because I'm not a guy. So as Chris said, I come from the performative arts sector, and I work in audiovisual sector for many years now. I don't have a technological degree, and I'm a beginner in the space industry. but maybe this will bring a new point of view to the things that you know so much about. To make the long story short, I'm not going to tell you the story of my career, of my life. What I would like to do is I would like to present you my new project that I'm working on. And it's quite a large thing. Funny that my production company is called UFO, but really that wasn't on purpose. It's just the way things happen sometimes. And so yes, unlimited film operations, there we go. What we do is we create a huge transmedia project about the future of humanity. And I work on it for a while already. And voila. And the project contains 4 elements, so it's like an umbrella project. And the first component, which is the most important and the one that we started with, is a full-length feature documentary movie called The Future of Forever. And in the movie, we are trying to analyze the future scenarios for humanity. So our field of interest in the film is life extension, transhumanism, artificial intelligence, and space colonization. And that's the reason I'm here. And around the movie, we decided to create a small galaxy of products that are related to the project, but that are addressed to different audiences and that are dedicated to the subjects that we touch upon in the movie. So then you have a virtual reality experience, which will actually be the first immersive virtual reality experience in which the user will live and survive his own death. We make a mobile game, which is an application, and the concept is very, very fresh. We just started to design it during the NASA hackathon in Warsaw, where I had the pleasure to meet JJ, who's responsible for me being here. And I will tell you a little bit more about it because it's a first non-fiction mobile game about Journey to Mars. So to be very, very brief, we want to create a game that will be with the user through his mobile phone. It's a first-person experience. And it will be a little bit like The Martian, just that it's going to be for real. What we want to do is we want to work with the agency, and we want to use only the actual tools, actual data, actual state of research that is currently at the disposal of the researchers. And we want to create a game based on it, which will be worldwide, which will be open widely to the audience, also letting people communicate with each other. That's very brief. And last but not least, we are designing a chatbot, which is going to be a chatbot who would communicate with the user via social media. And it's supposed to be the voice of the future, so it's a philosopher. It's not Siri, it's not calling you an ambulance or ordering a pizza. It would ask you questions about the most essential things in human life. So this is the future of forever. It's quite large, but let's do it. And well, voila. So why this project is unique? First of all, it's because we decided to join forces of people from different sectors. So artists, people of science, marketing specialists, they all work together to create a new image of what the future can bring, how we can change, what are the risks, and what is our responsibility. And this is a very uplifting project, I guess, because it's all about reminding ourselves that we, as Chris already said, are a very unique species. And our curiosity and our passion to design new worlds is something that makes us unique. And then, of course, it's all about creating the world of tomorrow, because the future of forever is not only something you watch, it's something that you experience and something where you can create your own vision of the world. Voilà. Very, very briefly, there's a lot of people on board, but it's still in process of development. So there's UFO, the company that's in the core of the production. We have recently signed a contract with Havas Media Group. To be precise, it's 18 Havas. It's one of the biggest media houses in Europe. HBO Europe stands behind the movie, and then still there are more co-producers in France, in Germany, and worldwide. So this is a long list of names. Most of them are very difficult Polish names. But just to show you something that I find very important is that due to the fact that I'm not a scientist, I have a security. I have someone who's working with me to make me feel secure. And this is Aleksandra Przegalińska, who's currently a scholar at the MIT, and she's a philosopher, and her fields of study is philosophy of AI and how technology is changing human life. And then, yes, we are very present since the very beginning of the development. Of course, this is mainly for the film and audiovisual industry, but then still now we are opening ourselves more towards the scientific milieu. Of course, we are very present online, so I invite you to join us on Twitter and on Facebook. And then in 2018, when we hope to deliver, the project will be distributed worldwide. So this is the address where you can find us, so I encourage you to follow us online. And I think there's nothing more to say than keep your fingers crossed, because there was no project like that before. And if we make it, it's going to be really something. So thank you very much.
Why not do something?
Just one more thing. Just to give you a very, very slight glimpse of what we are talking about in the movie, I will show you a video. It's early development stage, raw video. It's mainly found footage. So it's not an official trailer. It's not the way the film looks like, but this is what we're talking about in terms of subjects we want to study and analyze in the film. There you go.
Why not do something about aging and death? Make them optional. Let people choose whether they want to age or die. For whole body patients,
we don't call it immortality, we call it super longevity or radical life extension.
For the first time in history, a mind may be able to continue without a brain.
The long-term aspiration is to develop the technologies necessary to transport a large number of people and cargo to Mars.
There's a great deal of discourse about whether or not AI is going to be our God.
The future is just occurring as we speak.
Where is it all going?
The immortality idea, the selfishness of the immortality idea, is not especially attractive to me.
you can ask yourself, would I rather have died? Or, is it better to continue with those changes?
I'd like to see a world that valued every person.
We could exist in multiple environments here in this wonderful biosphere that we have here on Earth, as well as in near-Earth orbit.
I think we could probably send the first person in about 12 years.
Will you be that person?
Only if I'm confident that SpaceX will be fine if I die.
Technology is enabling a utopian project that has been purely utopian in the past. Now technology is enabling it to be real.
Why not do something about aging and death? Make them optional.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. So that's the presentations from our panelists. I'm now going to ask them, I think, one question and get their answers on that, and then we will throw it open to the floor and to the Twitterverse for your questions. So prepare those. So my question to the panelists is about the importance of narrative, okay? Because we've seen a number of different sorts of presentation here. We've seen books, stories, we've seen films, and we've seen what I would call more sort of an experience. So how do you see the role of narrative in your work? And are you for narrative, against narrative, or maybe narrative neutral? Let's start with Chris.
Well, I think if you're making a film, then narrative and character are everything. You know, if you don't have either of those, then you don't really have an audience. So for me, you know, when I'm starting out on a project, and in fact I'm looking at making a feature documentary on ALMA at the moment, the big radio telescope project out in Chile, and our challenge is really finding a clear sort of linear narrative for that, because ALMA is about exploring so many different aspects of cosmology and astronomy that we need to pin it down to kind of one key one to follow. Otherwise, if you don't have a kind of quest and a hero and a finish line, then it makes a film a bit kind of rambling and hard to follow. And at the end, we've all seen those kind of films. You leave thinking, well, I'm not going to get those 2 hours of my life back again. So they're really important, and I wouldn't embark on a film. I wouldn't want to waste my time making a film that didn't have narrative and character. And even actually First Orbit, which is an experiential film with music and pictures, and Gagarin saying he feels okay for about 108 minutes. Even that's got a story to it, and I don't necessarily advise you watch the whole thing in one go. You start tripping out in the middle of his night pass down the Pacific and start hallucinating, but even that has a kind of conclusion to it as well, and so it's really key, I think, in film anyway.
Okay, thank you. Eric?
This wasn't intentional, was it, that you put the two narrative guys on one side of the panel and the others on the other? It very much depends on the art form and the project. So obviously the things that Chris does and the things that I do, you know, very plot-driven, motion, narrative, as Chris has said, is obviously key. But I'm going to put that ISU interdisciplinary hat back on again and make an argument that the two are actually linked, because even in the narrative flow of a film or a story or a novel, it's a series or a continuum of individual experiential moments, and consequently even the experiential art forms, something like a painting or a sculpture, those things are not necessarily static, because every piece of art requires an active act of thought and engagement for the observer to be able to take it in and interpret and appreciate. A novel or a story is nothing more than light patterns on a liquid crystal screen or ink on a page until it's taken in by your eyes and interpreted in your head. So something that seems static and experiential, even that can have a narrative if you are looking at it on a different day and you're in a different emotional state or frame of mind, or the environment has changed in terms of how it's staged, or even what the light and sound conditions are around it, as a sort of constructive type of interference. These are dynamic and arguably narrative things, even in the other experiential types of art forms. So that's my ISU interdisciplinary answer. I hope I passed the exam.
Excellent, excellent answer. Tim?
Well, as you anticipate, well, we're sitting on the other side, and so we have a different...
Don't be mistaken.
Oh yes, yes. She mediates the whole thing probably, and well, I would even shape it differently and express it differently. In my work, I have a major plea, and I consider in the arts, to practice arts as physics, and this is a very German interpretation of physics, because if you take the German word physisch, you have a notion of corporal experience in it. So it's touching your body, and you have a lot of things, well, in the sciences which are touching and which are physical, and if a photon comes in, well, there happens something with your retina, and this is a physical component. especially from the visual arts context and with the background of the 20th century of art, which is quite much dependent on narration, because you're standing in front of a abstract painting, and the major thing is the narration, so in what it stands for. And I think art needs to come back again to more physical concepts. And because if you look to pictures, for instance, pictures are not only narration, it's not what they're telling about, but it's about pictures express, for instance, space in a very specific way. And you can translate this to language. And it's a bit coming away from symbolism, coming away from language, and to look how you can express things with different media and give them their own language. So that's my major concept of physics of the arts.
Okay, thank you, Tim. That suggests to me, as an engineer, there's a sort of spectrum, an axis of of narration. On one hand, you have very plot-driven stuff. On the other hand, you have the experiential stuff. So I don't know, where were you on the experiential narrative axis?
I take it all. I mean, yeah, I occupy all the axes. And by saying that, I mean that, first of all, I guess it comes from my experience. You adapt the medium to what you want to achieve. Meaning, if there is a story to tell, or if there's a thing to do, it will show you sooner or later how you should say it, using what tools and how you want to engage your audience. So there are things that should be told in a narrative way. For example, I cannot imagine not making The Future of Forever, the film, differently than by creating my story and taking the viewer by the hand to take him into my world, the way I see things. But then on the other hand, thanks to transmedia, thanks to the development of new technologies, thanks to the web and the tools that the web has created for us as artists, but also for audiovisual producers and also for the market, we can deliver experiences that are strictly based on the user experience. And then the story is not linear anymore. It's all a matter of what choices the user makes. It's all a matter of how he would behave, and it's his decision where and how he wants to experience the thing. So if we speak about interactive projects, or if we do VR installations, or if we do whatever else we can do thanks to the development of the new media, then the user is free to go. So I would say it really depends on the story. It depends on how much you want to be present as an artist with your strong voice. Sometimes you need to do it. Sometimes you can let it go, giving the user the freedom to create his story and choosing the way in the most random way. And then then nobody has the same experience.
Well, I would like to add something, because it's too much emotional about experience, talking about the physics. Let's go back to the 18th century. And well, I was talking before about space. And what happened in the 18th century is a tremendous change in spatial conception. Among others, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant was included in that revolution. It was just looking to this bright strip up on the sky, our Milky Way. He is one of the theorists doing this physical interpretation of the Milky Way as a flat disk. It was a physical, geometrical play. But the thing is with physics and geometry is there's no symbolism, there's no arbitrary in, because it really needs to fit geometrically. So and this makes it a bit different from narration. You can't tell every story about this. So, and what he even did, well, he looked to the nebula where they couldn't prove back it because the telescopes that didn't have the resolution at the time. He even looked to the shapes of nebula, and he looked to Andromeda and said, well, and this has a completely different shape. Probably this is also a star system as our Milky Way.
Okay, so Clearly, I think we have a range of views here. I don't think we're going to iterate to an agreed solution. So I think it's now time to engage the audience in a bigger debate. So any questions on? Whoops.
Was physics.
Physics, yes, gravity. It's questions there. I see one right away. Can we get a mic to Naum? No surprise that Naum, for those of us who know him, is in there fairly quickly.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. And I mean, I can see a clear thing in most of the work that you presented, and that is that you use space, of course, as a medium for inspiration, but also of creation. And I really believe that it's important that artists question how they are working with space. You're using space, and to use it, it means that it has to be functional and useful. NASA uses space, tourism is using space, mining is using space, and it seems that art today is yet another way of making space useful to sell space activities to society, government, to keep illustrating space activities, to engage society, etc. Today, artists are collaborating with space agencies, and there's a growing concern about what art is giving back to space activities. So my question is, don't you think that you as artists and as a community need a more radical approach in making space projects in a world that is obsessed with use, purpose, and functionality? And perhaps in that case, we really managed to inspire space activities.
So, who wants to make a claim to be the radical on the panel?
Can I try? I don't know if that answers your question, but it certainly rings a bell. What you said. I guess there are two things. Space is like a subject that we begin to talk about when there is a need to reflect something more, and I guess it's just a way, like, for example, I think artificial intelligence is not a technological project, it's a metaphysical project. And I guess space as a subject in which we try to find the answers is actually also a mirror that reflects where we are today as a society, as a civilization, what are our dreams, what we are afraid of. And I guess if we were talking about that before, that there were different moments in history when space, human activity in space had different meaning, and it was actually developed for different reasons. It always has a political aspect, I guess, and I think today it's something I am being extremely seduced with the space subjects today, because I guess we live in very uncertain times, and we sense all that things are changing, and I guess space gives us the possibility to name things and to express our fears and our will, how we would like to reconstruct the world in which we live in. So it's all about humans learning things about themselves and checking out whether they are still capable of creating a better world.
It's an excellent question. Space is not a program or a project. It's a place. It's a domain like the land, like the air, like the sea. So ultimately, it will be a domain for all human endeavors, be it science, commerce, and of course, the arts. It'll be as it is on the earth.
I'd add to that, I think to some extent we're in a kind of post-astronaut world here when it comes to human spaceflight. And by that I mean, I'd be surprised if everyone in this room can name every human being that's off Earth at the moment. Do you all know the names of the people that are on the space station right now? All of them? No, and I think that's a good thing. And the reason I think it's a good thing is that space has become a kind of an invisible thing. It's just part of our culture. It's just something we do. So, you know, those that are lucky enough to spend some time on the International Space Station, for me, they're not really astronauts anymore. They're medics and they're chemists and they're material scientists. And Kate Rubins, who's up there at the moment, who's a microbiologist, she's sequencing DNA. It's a laboratory where we do human activities. It just happens to be in orbit. And so, you know, in the 60s, we celebrated this extraordinary step that we'd all taken. But more than 50 years on from that now, it's sort of embedded invisibly in our culture. And Google plays a part in that as well. I think, you know, Google Earth also helps to make it invisible. Within 2 clicks, you're above the Earth and you're looking down on a city and you're navigating through it as if, you know, you too were in orbit. And I think, you know, the way that we as artists all sort of wrap that into our work, I think also reflects it. It's a backdrop rather than the focus anymore. And as I said, I think that's good.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'll go in the front. Should be a microphone. Oh, okay. We were going to go to the front first, but we can go there and then come to the front. That's fine, because there's a mic there. So, and then we'll come to the front.
Hey. So I want to come back to a comment. I don't remember in which one of the presentation it was, but the notion that the moment we saw the first image of the Earth from outer space, it unleashed this idea, which we are all part of this, you know, the blue speck, or how you want to call it, this jewel. And I think we are experiencing right now a kind of a pushback against this idea. I think we all feel it, whether it's with like Brexit or whatever is going with the election and other stuff. I think we feel there is some kind of pushback, not only in religious society, but in Western society as well, against those ideas of globality. And I wonder how you as artists address those things, and do you feel like you need in your stories to maybe tell the other side of it, and how do we kind of combat this pushback and resell the entire space optimism that we used to have like in the 60s? Not that I was alive like that, but you know what I'm talking about. Thanks.
You might know of an essay that Rusty Schweikart wrote when he came back from his Apollo flight. He didn't go to the moon. He tested the spacesuit in lunar orbit, and there was something went wrong with his EVA, and he just had to wait for further instructions, and it gave him a chance just to look at the view that he had. And he came back, and at the Lindisfarne conference, he stood up and he spoke pretty much without notes, actually, but somebody was recording it and wrote down what he said, and it became an essay that's attributed to him called No Frames, No Boundaries. And he talked at that time about this perspective that he'd had on the planet, this borderless sort of world. Now, in the decades since he flew, of course, all the borders are now visible. So in some respects from space, we no longer have this kind of borderless planet unless you get a long way back. However, one of the other spin-offs of Apollo, of course, was microcomputing, and ultimately, you know, the infrastructure for the internet and the World Wide Web, and that is the borderless planet that we've kind of inherited from that period in history, I think. And so, I mean, I think we're there, and we have it. And the problems that we suffer at the moment, and that it feels like there's something kind of cooking out there in society, are partly fueled by this borderless world where we kind of enter these social media spaces, and they work like echo chambers sometimes for us, where they just reinforce these ideas that we have. We don't get our ideas challenged very often. And of course, this isn't there's no kind of design in any of this. This is just a big experiment. You know, the internet's been running for like 6,000-7,000 days now, hasn't it, without sort of without any kind of plans or particular meetings or anything. That it's just sort of happened, and it's evolved that way. And so we are just part of this big experiment, and we're learning to live with the kind of consequences of that. It's part of our kind of social evolution, I think. And we were talking earlier before this, this panel about the context that you have to see these stories in. So as I spoke about earlier, I kind of grew up with this kind of backdrop of these first forays into space that we were all making as a species. And then those that were born in the 1990s or even the early 2000s have a different perspective on these missions that are unfolding. And so I think we have to kind of reflect that in the storytelling that we do. If you're telling an old story, you set it in that context. If you're telling a more current story or one that's more of our time, like Hubble, for example, you give it a different sort of vibe and a feeling set against a different zeitgeist. So I think that's how I kind of try and reflect things in my work.
Can I answer? Yes. I think it's all about courage, and we live in very uncertain times, and I think the world's going backwards. It's very dangerous, and instead of being curious and courageous and open and eager to discover new things, people are definitely choosing something completely opposite. And I guess what people like you do is an act of bravery, and it's an example to be followed, because as far as I can understand what you do and why you do it, I'm addressing to you as a certain milieu that I'm not a part of it. I'm just an observer. But I think, first of all, it's the courage to discover things and to question the status quo that is now. That's the first thing. And the second thing is to be aware of the response that every decision you make today will have consequences. And I guess the lack of courage and the lack of responsibility for what we do, this is not only about ecology, it's also about politics, economy, everything, is the reason why our situation is so insecure today. So I believe that, being linked to people who work in the space industry, we can show in a very, very good way and encourage people who don't do that to change the way they look at life. And that's the reason why I have chosen to follow this subject and to learn about it, because I think it's a certain model that is very necessary today. And I think everyone should learn about it, because that's the only thing that can save us.
One of my favorite scenes from one of my favorite films, Apollo 13, is when Tom Hanks, playing Jim Lovell, turns to his wife after they've watched the Apollo 11 landing, and he says to her, "No, that's not a miracle. That's not a miracle that happened. It's we did that. We decided to do it. We decided to go." So, and space and the exploration of space is the ultimate expression and culmination of the Enlightenment and the rationalist and the scientific worldview. And yes, I do agree with my fellow panelists, and I do agree with you, sir, that this is something that unfortunately is under threat right now. And perhaps one of the reasons it is under threat is that there is often a perception that the scientific and the rationalist sort of empirical worldview is cold and dehumanizing, and nothing can be further from the truth. So perhaps, as difficult perhaps, our responsibility or job as artists is to, as they say in North America, take the edge off a little bit and humanize, put a human face to these grand endeavors, and remind them that, remind people that this isn't numbers and just numbers and equations and hardware, but for every space mission, every endeavor, there are human hands and hearts and minds behind that. And I think that's an important message that all of us here and artists everywhere can bring forth.
I would add a different view to it. Well, one is a time component, And normally if you meet scientists, engineers, the big question is always what's next. And an artist also likes to look back and look to the past, what happened in the past. And on the other way, he can have a quite cool worldview, and it's a quite formal worldview. And think about, well, you mentioned the Earth, a globe, a sphere, and artists can think about in a very formal way what means a sphere, a global thinking, and what's a model of a globe, and when came it up in history. So it came up end of the 15th century. And look, and you can observe there appears a pattern of a kind of looking from outside. It's the same what made physically the astronauts later, but the pattern starts up with having here the globe and look outside it. And this is the start of globalization. 100 years later, we had the First World War, if we want to bring in the political component. The First World War was the war of Spain against the Netherlands, because this touched the colonies in Indonesia, for instance. So this is where globalization starts, and I'm not that pessimistic. Well, I think it's more like up and down, and it's also our job look back to the history, look into patterns which might appear, which disappear, and probably we can give it also a positive push in a certain direction.
Okay, thank you. We've got time. I see time is getting on, so we have time for one more question. So we will come down the front here to...
Hello, thanks for a great panel session. So I imagine there's a lot of you in your work, and I would hope that if you wouldn't mind sharing with us why you pick the art form that you do, and is there something in your work that has a common thread that you're trying to explore for yourself? Is there something that you're trying to figure out about yourself, or is it more just about a global picture of something?
Well, for me, the question's quite, the answer is quite easy, because I have conceptual questions, and you saw at the end sound installation, and I came back to sound in the last 5-6 years, just because of the question. Initially, I came to sound just by connecting things in space, and I discovered I could do it easily, but just by frequency tracking. And with light, it's simply difficult. I made an interactive sound system based on neurobiological rules. It's too much in your details. And finally, well, for the Heavens Carousel, it took me 2 years. I think, oh, expansion of the universe, what could I do? And it was just, well, you know, I'm sitting back from the theater in the train. It's like, oh, I use sound instead of light, and this was it. And this is simply how it works. I do not make a self-definition just by a medium. I'm not a painter. You say, as I'm a painter, this is a statement. Now I'm a conceptual artist, interested in certain things. I'm interested conceptually in space. This is one of my big subjects, and well, showing what space makes and how other people also work on it. It's not kind of introspective. It's more looking outside what happens, what other people observe, and what happened in the history of mankind with different space concepts. And finally, I find my medial answer, and that's it.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Anyone else?
Well, I think I started, I guess, my science career by, you know, absorbing a lot of the cultural references that Eric was talking about. You know, I lived on this diet of TV science documentaries, and I kind of thought that meant I wanted to be a scientist. So that's why I went into science, and then I realized I wasn't good enough to make a career out of science. But I also realized that actually the thing I'd really loved as a kid was the stories and the characters, not necessarily just the science. And so I shifted and I went into sort of science writing, science journalism for a while. But I think the thing about storytelling is that you want to harness everything for that, you know. And I've written, and I've done radio for a long time, and now I mostly make films because I can use all of that. If you make films, you mostly write. You sit down and you think of ideas and you write and you write and you write and you write, and then you go out and you turn those written ideas into this rich tapestry of kind of pictures and connections and junctions and things that if you just stick to one media, you can't do so easily. And then there's the extra layer of the sound design on top of that, which is just a thrilling kind of further dimension to it. So I think that's why I've sort of settled in film as a medium that I just adore, you know, reveling in. And so that's the first part of your question. And then the other one was about what we're looking for in ourselves or something, somehow. And that's a harder one to answer. I mean, I think we make sense of our lives through telling our own sort of stories, and we reinvent ourselves in our heads through our stories. We've all got stories right now in our heads that define who we are, and they might not always be the truth, but there are truths, and that's perhaps all that matters, really. And I guess in searching for stories to tell, you always place part of yourself in that, and maybe even you learn new truths about yourself with every story of others that you tell, and I hope I can do that for the rest of my life.
So why did I pick this particular medium of writing? And I have a very short answer for that. It's the cheapest one of the four up here, because all you need is a computer or even a pen and paper if you wish. I've been extremely privileged in my professional life to be just a very small part of this grand adventure that we call our venture into space. And so I see my writing as an extension of that I can take the things that I've been privileged to experience or learn in my day job and just sort of take it one step further, extrapolate it a little bit. And that's to me just tremendous fun. And if you can perhaps forgive the conceit, there is a little bit of a Gene Roddenberry in me that I truly believe this is one of the most important endeavors of us, humanity as a species, and I do want to do my part to spread the good word that, hey, this is something we ought to be doing, and exploring the bottom of the ocean too, at that point.
Okay. This is a terrible question because it's extremely personal, I guess. At least, I mean, for me, my job is my life. I mean, I breathe as I work. Cannot imagine doing anything else. Of course, I've done many things in life because I have to earn my living. But at the end of the day, if you're a creator, and then there you go, you have to. I thought I would be working in a theater. I always knew I would be a director. I couldn't be anything else. So it's really hard to work with me because I always have to be the last one who says this. But in theater, there's very little control over what's happening if you're a director. And you're depending on so many aspects that you cannot control. So when I made my first film, and it was about art and love, and it was a completely different thing than the thing I'm doing now, I realized that this is the place where I can get full control over what I want to say, and this is how I became a filmmaker. And I think I never looked for stories. The story is always coming. And I guess it's also related to the moment in life. I make the future, you're not going to see that in the movie, but I make the future of forever because I have experienced a terrible death experience. And I'm doing this film because probably if I would be a psychologist, I would say because I want to convince myself that life is worth living. So I'm looking for people who are like contemporary Leonardo da Vinci's. And I ask them, what are you fighting for? Why do you want to give your life to science, robots, or whatever? What's so important? I mean, why are you so scared of dying? So you want to create a world that will, be something when you're gone. So it's all about that. So I guess it's always very personal. It depends whether you show it or not. I mean, there are artists who, when they lose their father, they would make a film about the fact that they lost their father. I am not making a film about the fact that I lost my father, but this is the reason why I do this film. So there we go.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Anna. Personal. So that brings us to the end of the panel. Our narratives, our experiences have intersected here tonight. I hope we have a new set of stories, maybe some new visions for where we might go in the future. I'd like to thank the panelists, Anna, Tim, Eric, Chris, and I'd invite you to do the same. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Chris, for being our moderator today. I'd like to invite everyone to continue this conversation with our panelists at our reception as we end this formal part of our evening. I'd also like to remind you that on August 15th, we'll be back here for our final distinguished lecture of this SSP with noted astronomer David Levy. So you're all invited to that as well. So once again, let's thank Chris and our panelists and continue this conversation at the reception. Thank you, everyone.